What is the extent of diversity in the world? How diverse is the world truly? Good afternoon, I am Dr. Kajit John Paul, back to talk about this question today, and I have 3 points to make. First, that the world is much more diverse than we may recognize popularly, conventionally. Secondly, the question of the true extent of the diversity of the world. And thirdly, how to manage this diversity of the world, the management of the world's diversity. The first point, number 1, the world is much more diverse than we may recognize. The first question in talking about this is, what do we know? What do we recognize? Well, we know that there are countries, and that is the framework upon which the international order is run. How many countries? We can easily reckon that. But what exactly is the extent of diversity? The dominant framework, the dominant way of looking at the world is through the concept of countries, nations, the nation-state idea. Many may call it the Westphalian nation-state construct. Now, the building of this framework arose from the European narrative and construct of the world, of the nation-state. And the whole law of nations and the international order arose from this. And in this you find the categorization of humanity into nations, civilized nations, barbarians, and savages. This was in the build-up to the formation of the international world order. Now, nations, civilized nations, were those categorized as those who have the right intrinsically to be recognized under international law, with full right to recognition. The barbarians were categorized as people who were almost civilized but not exactly Christian, like the Ottoman Empire and the identities under that empire, and those were considered the barbarians. Then the third category were the savages, all the others, the Indians, the Asians, the Africans, and they were called savages. Now, in this context, recognition was accorded to nations, nation-state, the civilized Christian nations of Europe. First of all, you find this in the writings of prominent international law scholars. James Lorimer prominently played a crucial role in the formation of this doctrine of recognition under international law. Now, how did the barbarians and savages come into the international law framework? Well, that is where slavery and colonialism come in. For these savages outside of civilization to be included in the in the construct of the organized world, the globalized world, they have to be given, because they have to be given identity, they have to be given countries, they have to be given order. Why? Because the European understanding of the other, the outsider, had no way of recognizing the ways of life and organizing society of these others as valid. There came in the doctrine of terra nullius, vacant lands to be occupied, and well, in a certain context, anima nullius, people without souls. So this is the dominant framework, and in some extreme circumstances, the Europeans were seen as the full humans, the non-Europeans as subhuman. That is why, as recently as 1906, a man by the name Otabenga was taken from the Congo by an American to America, and he was exhibited in the zoo. He was actually put in a cage next to the baboons, and next to another Native American by the name Ishi at the Bronx Zoo exhibitions. And that's how he was, you know, for people to come and see, and that Darwinian narrative of reducing the non-European as some sort of non-human. Of course, we know that on the 20th of March 1916, Otabenga, tired of waiting to go back home, was able to lay his hands on the gun of his masters. Then he performed the rites of his people, knocked off the crowns of his teeth, put a fire, danced around the fire, and shot himself. You also have Sarah Bartman, who in 1810 was taken from South Africa to England, to London, for exhibition as a human species, one of the inferior species. Her genitalia, her body structures were put on display. Negative. If you Google it, you will see it. So she eventually died in France in 1815. Now, these narratives of the nation and the savages, the barbarians, is what is, led to is at the foundation of the building of this international order. So, in colonizing these non-Europeans, he imposed borders, typical of the Berlin Conference, where you draw arbitrary lines all over and give them order. And based on that European imposition of order or construct for non-Europeans, you now call them a nation, and they are recognized. That's why you have, when you talk of Nigeria, South Africa, Ivory Coast, and Egypt, India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, which, even though that came subsequently, or the nation states in South America. This is how identity was imposed on the non-European as a precondition for recognition and admission into the civilized world order. And secondly, on the question of the definition of identity, who is a nation? Why is it that the English is a nation, but Yoruba is a tribe? English is a nation, the Inuit is a tribe, or in dominant construction of identity. This is rooted also in this ideology, this thinking that is at the foundation of the construction of world order. That's how you have nations and tribes. So this is a dominant framework. Looking at this, therefore, you can see that the world is really more diverse than it presents itself to be. Secondly, what is the true extent of the world's diversity today? Without saying very much, we'll just go straight. First, I'll begin with Europe here in Britain. Despite centuries of efforts to construct this idea of Britain as a nation, we know very well today that Britain is a state, multinational state, with many nations. The Welsh, the Scottish, the, Northern Irish, which itself is an uncomfortable kind of way of intruding into some other identities' ancestral homeland, and it's part of the United Kingdom. Legacies of empire. And then you have the Cornish, the Cornwall people of Cornwall, who were recognized last year as a nation. Now, when you go to Spain, you have the Catalonian people, the Basque country, and in Italy, Corsica, the Parisians. In different parts of Europe, you have these nations dominantly recognized. Now, moving on to the frontier states of European imperialism, I would say, the USA, Canada, Australia, New Zealand. The construct, the idea of America belies or obscures the reality of diversity. Well, the US Department of Indian Affairs is kind enough to document the number of identities that are called tribes. There are 566 of them. You can check the website and see. Now these, if we had an objective criteria of defining identity, we qualify as nations. In as much as identity entails certain things like language, ancestral homeland, the claim to autonomy, and a distinct culture, these identities reduced to this subhuman categories would qualify as nations. In the case of Johnson and McIntosh, decided in 1823, the U.S. Supreme Court, presided over by Chief Justice John Marshall, traced the origin of the doctrine of discovery, whereby, by the laws of nations, any European power which invades a new territory acquires radical title, sovereignty, to the land it discovers, therefore wiping out the rights of the pre-existing peoples. And that is the kind of logic that underpins the international law construct that we have. And that's why in the previous video, when I said the world order of today is fundamentally unjust, founded on unjust decayed principles, this is part of it. So in those states you have the African Americans, European Americans. That is how I would call it, because we need a consistent and mutually intelligible way of defining identity that doesn't contain